Well, welcome everybody. My name is Kate Brunner, and I am one of the regional early literacy specialists at the Colorado State Library. I just want to say thank you to everybody for joining us today for our Quick Bite series and this particular topic today, which is brilliant baby brains, early learning, and 0 to 5 brain development. So just to quickly sort of introduce the team and a little bit about the Growing Readers Together project. We are an expansion of that original Growing Readers Together program. This early literacy support team is a new thing for the Colorado State Library that has launched this year. And it consists of 3 early literacy specialists, myself, Melody Garcia, and Gail Yerbeck. And we've been launching these Quick Bite series as, sort of a way of introducing the team and sharing some early literacy information with children's and youth librarians in Colorado and around the country. As we can see today, there's lots of people logging in from all over. And Growing Readers Together is a project that focuses on connecting Colorado libraries with informal family, friends, and neighbor caregivers in their communities. And this came about because of the early childhood landscape in Colorado. In 2013, there was a report that was released that basically said that up to 57% of children under 6 in working families in the state of Colorado are cared for informally by family members, friends, and neighbors. So they are not in some sort of licensed, structured early childhood care environment. So, Growing Readers Together has the intention of supporting transparent and accessible early learning in all Colorado libraries and connecting the children who are in that FFN care situations and their devoted caregivers to early learning and early literacy resources. So today's quick bite, focused on brilliant babies, has 3 basic learning outcomes. We are going to talk about the very, very basic, sort of bare bones 0 to 5 brain development. Some just really important key facts around that, and then how this can inform our early learning interactions in a public library environment, and how we can encourage family, friends, and neighbors, caregivers to kind of take home that information and those applications in order to continue to create early learning environments that support brain development. So, in the first 5 years of life, there really is an incredible amount of early brain growth going on. When children are born, their brains are about 25% of adult size, but by age 3, they've reached 80% of adult size, which is an incredible amount of growth if you think about it. It is absolutely unbelievable to me that when a child is born, they have 100 billion neurons. Like, to put that in context, that's like as many stars are in the Milky Way, roughly, like comparable if you think about it. So just a staggering number of brain cells, just from the moment they're born. And from that time period through age 2 to 3, they're going to create about 15,000 synapses or connections or bridges between all the neurons in their brains. And the way that happens actually is, really driven by their experiences and their environment during those early years. So you have this massive amount of synapse creation going on. And then at the same time, the other aspect of that is that the brain is also, making connections and then pruning the ones they're not using. So there is this really incredible, I've heard it referred to as a sculpting process. And I really think that's kind of an interesting concept to think about it that way. And it's really environmentally driven. The connections that are being used on a regular basis, the connections that are reinforced over and over again are strengthened, and the connections that are initially made but then not continuously used, the brain prunes them, doesn't need them anymore. It's an incredibly efficient process. And so, this is really a critical period of learning and brain growth for young children. But one of the things I find really interesting in this when we talk about early learning is that, and anyone who's read Marianne Wolf's book, Proust and the Squid, has probably come across this information before, is that the brain is naturally wired for language acquisition, for oral language acquisition. So, you don't really have to be taught to speak. You learn to speak by being surrounded by other human beings who are speaking a particular language that goes, that is part of your culture. And so by being exposed to that, you develop oral language. And it just sort of happens because there are genetic influences that are at play there, and children develop oral language. But reading is a whole other thing. And print literacy is actually really not a natural function of the human brain. So there is a huge amount of learning that has to go into developing and developing reading readiness before the reading itself even happens. And so we all know about these early literacy practices, and what they're doing is actually priming a child's brain to learn to read, helping to make the connections that will support the actual mechanics of reading, so that the brain can build on those previous connections. So the best environments for that, because this is really an environmentally driven process. Before we can even start talking about like the every child ready to read practices, you need a supportive environment for those practices to be taking place in. So the best environments that really foster that early brain development, that set up maximizing the impact of using those early literacy practices, are environments that allow children to think and explore, give them opportunities to focus on things, opportunities to respond to what they're exploring, and then this interactive component. You really need this interpersonal, interactive exchange that happens between a child and other children, or between a child and adults. And it's these interactions also help them build connections to previous experiences, and so they continue to build on that. And those are those synapses, those pathways that are getting reinforced over and over again. And so those ones get stronger and stronger. And then that helps, all of this just helps support further early learning. So it's really building your environment in which to um, apply the early literacy practices is a very important piece of the puzzle. So, and then also encouraging caregivers, parents, caregivers, family, friends, and neighbor caregivers to build those sorts of environments as well. So, building that environment is really about relationship. It can be about physical stuff as well, but it's really about the quality of the relationships you're building in that space, and how children are associating the interactions they're having and the relationships they're building. So, social emotional literacy is really what we're talking about here. It's the social emotional component of things, and it really is a precursor to successful early literacy learning and literacy readiness. So, the reason for this really has to do a lot to do with the fact that, a brain that is bathed in stress hormone, dealing with toxic stress at a very young age, high levels of cortisol in the brain, like this is a brain that can only focus on survival, right? And so it's very hard to develop new neural pathways, basically, in a brain that is under stress. So stress inhibits learning. This is sort of like intuitive when you think about it. Like we know that kids who are having fun, having a good time, they usually do have a richer learning experience in that. But there is actually neurobiology and brain chemistry behind why that is. And on the other hand, kids who are experiencing joy, feeling loved, feeling secure, kids whose brains are experiencing oxytocin, those are those are brains that are making stronger synaptic connections between neurons and reinforcing those positive ones over and over again. So the social emotional literacy piece, the social emotional learning and creating these supportive environments and these supportive relationships actually supports and augments the impact of applying early literacy practices. So, when you're talking and playing and singing and reading and writing, those are so much more impactful when children are doing it in an environment where they feel secure and safe and cared for. And also, you're continuing to build their social emotional literacy as well, and that emotional intelligence, that emotional quotient, research is showing is a very strong predictor of a young person's ability to thrive later in life. So, play is actually an incredible relationship building tool. So that's why when I was writing the title for this slide, I just put play, 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 play. We all know play is learning, and there's different kinds of play. And so there's the idea behind free play, that it's child-led, that the child shows you what they're interested in. The child brings you something that you want to engage in. And then there's this idea of guided play. And and I think that's a little bit more what we encourage in a lot of our programming, I think. But something to think about there is adult guided as opposed to scripted. One of the things that's really interesting about brain development in this 0 to 5 age range, especially the 0 to 3 age range, it takes them a little bit longer to process things than it does. Our processing speed is a lot faster, actually. So, and we'll talk about that in just a minute a little bit more. But giving them the opportunity to, guide them as opposed to give them very strict protocols in which to work, and then holding space for them, to process and respond. That's really an incredible relationship building tool there. And so, again, to think about activities that you can do within the library, within your early literacy programming, that really focus on process as opposed to product, and focus on relationship building with child and with their caregiver, as opposed to accomplishing very specific physical, concrete, like craft tasks or that sort of thing. So. And then this idea of interacting with a child either through free play or guided play, there's a really, really great process that comes from the Center on the Developing Child at Harvard University, and that serve and return interaction that's there in blue on the slide is actually a live link. And they have a really great, it's like 6-minute video you can watch on this. But basically, when we're talking about serve and return, the idea is that this is something that begins. Yes, thank you. Thanks, Christine. Just put the link directly in the chat, which is fabulous. And so the idea is that the child serves up an opening, an invitation to interaction, and then the adult returns or responds. And this is a cyclical process and an iterative process, and something that really begins at infancy, when a child makes eye contact or when a child cries and a caregiver responds. So this is from the very get-go. This is a process that you can talk with caregivers about. It's a process you can use in your library as well. And it basically consists of 5 steps to help you build responsive relationships. And the first one is to share the focus with the child. And so you are basically stepping into the child's interest. What is the child focused on? When a child points at something or brings you something or opens a conversation about something, and that is the process of what the Center for the Developing Child calls noticing the serve. And so you have to be open to noticing the serve to enter this serve and return process. So, and when they point out something they're interested in, and you acknowledge, oh, I see what you're interested in, that is like that first step in this process. And then the next step is to support and encourage them. And this can be through facial expressions, through spoken words, through moving your body the same way they're moving their body. If they're pointing at an object of interest, bringing it to them, and really just sort of encouraging them to explore, again, and holding space for that. And then the third step is naming this object of their focus. Then that might be naming what they're seeing. It might be giving name to an emotion, or it might be giving name to an action, but it helps them build understanding, language, and context. And so, again, this is a lot like when we talk about our early literacy practices and we talk about talking with children and playing with children. You're giving them words for things, introducing them to vocabulary. And also, if you're introducing vocabulary around emotions, then you are building that social emotional literacy at the same time. And then step 4, I feel like, is really so important. Steps 4 and 5 in this serve and return process. And step 4 is to take turns back and forth. And this is where children start to develop executive function and collaboration. And waiting is really important, and not their waiting, but our waiting as the adults, as the caregiver, as the librarian. So holding space for them to respond takes patience. And again, it's a processing speed when we talk about how fast our brains process information, how fast their brains process information. If you think about all those different neural pathways that they're building, 15,000 pathways per neuron. Like that information, when they process and experience, is actually having to travel a lot of pathways to cover as much territory as our more sculpted brains and more efficient pathways are. So, sometimes when you ask a toddler a question, it's important to wait. They're not necessarily going to answer you immediately. They may still be processing your question, and remembering that, and encouraging caregivers to remember that as well. That the answer will come, but you have to take turns, and you have to kind of move at their speed. And then step 5 is also really important, I think, and it's practicing endings or beginnings. So if a child walks away in the middle of from a book in the middle of reading it, or puts down a toy and moves on, and 2 minutes ago they seemed completely enamored with it, that's an ending. And so paying attention to a child's cues around when they're done with something, and children at in this age range, like, are going to have shorter attention spans and be more distractible, and they're exploring the world around them. There's so much for them to explore, right? And the advantage of being mindful about paying attention to endings is that you're actually holding space for new beginnings. And it keeps that, joyful exploration and the neurochemical basis around that, oxytocin, like all those positive reinforcing um, sorts of influences and hormones going on in the brain, building new pathways and all that. It keeps that flowing, versus when you force a young child to stay engaged in a particular activity, you're actually activating stress hormones in their body a lot of the times. And that ability to make new pathways in their brains or reinforce other pathways, and that ability to continue to grow their brains and make connections, kind of shuts down, because stress hormones and cortisol and whatnot are shunting it more towards as they enter more of a survival type space. So I really encourage you to use that link and kind of watch their video on this. It's a really interesting process when you start to become mindful of it, and it's really interesting when you invest in building this as a practice when you interact with young children in your library, and then you are modeling that for caregivers, and you can kind of explain um, why and how this works as you interact with young children. So that is kind of a very basic, very quick bite into brain development with young children and how it can influence how we interact with them in the library, and how we model behavior for caregivers. So I wanted to kind of give people a couple of minutes. We've got a tiny bit of time. If you have any specific questions or comments around either or ideas that you've tried as well, things you've tried in working with babies and young children and caregivers in your library. If you'd like to share that in the chat box, please feel free to do so. Oh, my pleasure. This is a topic I find fascinating, so I love talking about it. Anytime I get a chance to geek out a little on, on this with people who are interested, I'm excited to do so. Well, I wanted to say thank you to all of you also for joining us. And we have one more Quick Bites scheduled so far in this series next week on September 17th. And this one will be given by Melody Garcia, and she's going to be actually talking about this idea of process over product, and process art, and all of that. So please consider joining us for that one as well. And if you'd like to reach out to me, I am happy to chat more about this, or point you towards more resources if you're interested. Also, if you have any questions about growing readers together or anything like that, again, please feel free to reach out. And in addition to our next Quick Bite, we are considering doing more of these. We find them exciting and fun, and a great opportunity to kind of share and introduce information on various early learning topics. So on the next slide, in just a second, we're going to put up, we do have a feedback survey link. And if you're interested, please take a moment in filling that out and let us know if you'd like to see more Quick Bites, because we're considering doing another round of them as well. So we would love feedback on that. Also, if you're going to be in Colorado and you're going to be at CalCon next week, we are all three of us going to be at the State Library booth, hosting a tea party for some early literacy chats around, programming and challenges or success stories that you'd like to share with us around reaching informal caregivers in your community. So please do stop by the State Library booth and come see us. Come have a cup of tea. And then also we're going to be presenting at the Colorado Libraries for Early Literacy Conference. So we would love to see you all there and connect with you there as well in October. And in addition, if you're interested in potentially bringing us to your library to help you facilitate some caregiver-oriented programming, we would love to talk with you further about that. So please do not hesitate to reach out to us.
And Kate, really quickly, Heather had a question earlier in the chat about, are there ways that you can encourage parents to allow that process over product? Maybe it's something that's going to be talked about next week. But she's finding sometimes in the library, the parents are kind of taking over the projects, and are there ways that librarians can sort of guide them?
Right. I try, for me personally, what's been helpful, because I also work in a small rural library as well as working on this project. And what's been helpful is to engage in like the types of projects that don't end up with a product that looks exactly the same. And also to not make an example myself, if that makes sense. So it's a little bit tricky sometimes, because people kind of like that visual of like, this is the thing that we're doing and that's what it should look like when it's done. But what I find is if I don't make an example, it sort of opens up the possibilities like that they should, that it could look like anything, whatever we're doing. And then also I do a lot of just modeling dialogue with the kids as they're doing something, like, oh, that's really interesting. Look at the line that's making, like, or, oh, how did you decide to do that? And sometimes they, the answers they give me are, 3-year-old answers. So I don't get a complex, structural analysis of what they're doing, but it just kind of models those open-ended questions, I think. And then I just also keep reinforcing that it's the experience of this activity, like with caregivers over and over again. We're not trying to make anything in particular. We're just introducing an experience. So also, I think people are sharing some really great ideas in the chat. So definitely take a look at those.